This is Tar Heel Talk, an in-depth look at the issues and people making news in North Carolina. Here's your host, Sonia Williams.
Cedars in the Pines is a new exhibit at the North Carolina Museum of History. This exhibit commemorates the history and contributions of Lebanese immigrants who have made North Carolina their homes since the 1880s. And joining me now to tell us more about the exhibit and the project as a whole is Dr. Akram, Director of the Kerala Program for Lebanese American Studies at North Carolina State University. Doctor, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Cater. It's good to see you again.
Thank you. It's good to be here again.
All right. Now, this project, Cedars in the Pines, this exhibit is a part of a much larger project to highlight the work and the history of Lebanese Americans here in North Carolina. Talk a little bit about the project as a whole and how it all came about.
Absolutely. So shortly after 9/11, I think one of the things that became very clear is that the view of Arab Americans in general, and in particular Lebanese Americans, became very much focused on this idea of terrorism and on the idea of Arab Americans as the other, that people that are alien from American values and American history and American society. And so my good friend, Dr. Moiz Khairallah, came to me and basically said, you know, I would really like to do something to highlight the fact that we precede 9/11 and we have done a lot of different things. And so I was wondering if we can come up with a project together. Thanks to his funding and the work that we have done at NC State University, what we decided to do is to start collecting these oral histories. And we have been doing that for about 4 years now, going around the state of North Carolina, collecting oral histories from people who arrived maybe last year, or people whose ancestors arrived here in 1880, but all coming from this area we call Lebanon and making North Carolina their home. And in collecting these stories, we have built an archive. And one of the things we did is a documentary telling these collective stories, if you will. And that aired about 2 years ago, that premiered here, and we had wonderful success with that. And then we decided to follow up with this museum exhibit. And so this is part of this overall project that we have been doing.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the museum exhibit.
Sure.
What kinds of things will be included or are included because it's open now?
Well, the exhibit itself is using sort of multimedia to tell this story. And in essence, what we decided to do is to divide the story into 3 parts. The first part is called Journeys. The second is called Being, and the third is Belonging. And the idea is very simple. The Journeys is basically telling the story of people who left and why they left. And I think that applies not only to Lebanese Americans, but immigrants in general. Why would anybody leave their home and come to the United States? What compels people to uproot themselves in many ways and come here? And so we look at the stories of people, again, from the first wave, 1880 to 1920, and the second wave, which is after 1975. The section that is called Belonging is looking at how these various people who arrived here tried to integrate into North Carolina through work, through community volunteerism, through their lives here. And the third one is how they kept a sense of identity, a sense of heritage, who they are. So not only are they becoming North Carolinians, but also they're bringing a sense of being Lebanese into North Carolina. Now, to tell this story, we have a variety of things. We have text, we have images that we have collected from people who have been very kind to us and who have loaned us some of their memorabilia, their family photos. We have objects, anything from somebody's old you know, a mortar and pestle to make kibbe, which is a very Lebanese dish, to their, you know, Arabic Bible that they brought with them to keep in touch with their faith and their language, so to speak. We have audio and visual recordings that we are using, some music that was recorded here in New York in the early 1900s, as well as, of course, interactive, you know, digital media that we have been designing at NC State. And so using this kind of multimedia approach, we hope to engage people and to give them a sense of what it meant to be an immigrant and to sort of come here and make a life for yourself here.
Let's talk about part 1 of the project, or the exhibit, The Journeys. I'm sure you have some really incredible stories about why certain families left Lebanon. Talk a little bit about some of those stories.
Well, what's interesting is I think if you look at the end of the 19th century especially, but even after, the reason immigrants leave is because they're trying to make a better life for themselves. I mean, I think a lot of times we think of immigrants in sort of stereotypical fashion of taking away our jobs or what have you, but very often these folks come, regardless of where they come from, to make a better life for themselves and for their children. I mean, they have really good work ethic and they have good family values, and that's what compels them to leave everything they know the very comfortable environment they're in, their language, their villages, their families, their clothes, their food, to sort of leave it all behind and come here. And so I think what you find is that that was the impetus for a lot of people from Lebanon to leave. Now, some people had personal reasons, they may have gotten into quarrels with families and they decided to leave. Some were adventurous, some because they feared persecution because of their faith, but the great majority left because of economic crises that basically compelled them to leave and to undertake it. The difference is this: in the first wave, what we find is mostly they are farmers, peasants really, who leave villages of Lebanon because the major cash crop, which was silk, collapses completely by the end of the 19th century, and all of a sudden their livelihood is gone, and then they get on boats and they travel to the Americas, South America, Central America, and North America. The second wave, which comes after 1975, is different. They're primarily professionals, either having a university degree or seeking a university degree. And so what you see is a very different group of people. You see doctors, lawyers, engineers, professors like myself, arriving here and sort of entering into the American middle class a little bit faster. But the reasons are really, in both cases, pretty much the same. They're coming to make a life for themselves here.
Now, when you talk about some of those very early stories in particular, families shared a lot of their personal journey, if you will.
Sure.
Can you tell us about maybe one particular family and their personal journey?
Absolutely. So, I mean, one of the families is the Mack family from Morrisville, North Carolina. Mooresville. And what is interesting about the Mack family is that they arrive in New York, like that's the port of entry for the majority of the people. They arrive at Ellis Island, and their name is not Mack, their name is Makhul. And of course, you can imagine the sort of, the clerk at the Ellis Island writing this name, and M-A-C-K, and that's pretty much the end of it. And so they become the Mack family. Now they arrive, the grandfather arrives, and he really is driven here again to make a better life. He actually was heading to South Carolina, Mooresville, South Carolina. But he doesn't speak English, and he has a piece of paper. He looks at it, it looks like Mooresville. He gets off at Mooresville, North Carolina, and he looks absolutely lost. And the train conductor, who also got off there, sees that the poor man is lost, and he was a very kind soul, so he invites him to his house. And the next day, he puts him in touch with a Lebanese merchant in Charlotte. And this guy begins what most of these early immigrants do. They pick up suitcases, they fill them with thread, needles, lace, you name it, and they start walking, miles and miles, the back roads of North Carolina, selling at farmhouses in small towns. They become basically the original Sears catalog, because at that time they had no stores. And so they would arrive there, and they would be expected almost to arrive, and they would make circuits. And he accumulated enough money that he brings his family over, which is again typical, this chain migration. He comes in, accumulates enough money to call, to bring his children over, and they come over, and they accumulate enough money, they open a little store, and they have a store in, Mooresville. And then, of course, the grandson, so by the first generation, they're going to college. Many of them attend Davidson College, actually. And one of them attends Duke at a scholarship, a football player for Duke. And then ultimately, he becomes John Mack, who is the CEO of City Corporation.
Wow. It's a
Right?
very
So, I mean, within about
family.
75 years, they had made that transition throughout the whole process. It's really quite a remarkable story.
Absolutely. We're going to take a break. We'll talk more in just a minute.
Sure. Thanks.
We'll be back with more on the Lebanese American Project in North Carolina when Tar Heel Talk continues. Today's show focuses on Lebanese American history in North Carolina and a new exhibit designed to preserve and publicize that rich history. With us again is Dr. Akram, Director of the Kerala Program for Lebanese American Studies at NC State University. Now, before the break, you were talking a little bit about some of the family's personal stories, some of those early personal stories. Talk about phase 2 of the project and how that plays out in the exhibit.
Sure. So, I mean, I think one of the first things that they have to do is when they arrive here, is they have to integrate themselves into the society, into this economy. They came here, many of them, to make money and possibly, you know, to stay and make lives for themselves. So I think one of the difficulties was, how do you do that? Because they arrive, especially the first wave, they arrive at a time of the Jim Crow South. And as one of our people that we interviewed said, you know, they were foreigners and they were Catholics, and I think in the South in the 1890s and 1900s, that's 2 strikes against you. So I think they were trying to find a place for themselves, and the way they did it is by hard work. I mean, they really proved themselves through hard work, by becoming indispensable to many communities. As I was talking about earlier, the very type of work they did, which is to bring, in essence, the store to the farmhouse in the small town, makes them this kind of indispensable character. And I think in that sense they belong. But very quickly what they also decide is they have to become American. And what that means for them is they have to dress like Americans. So one of the first things they do is they change the type of clothing they're wearing. And even though the first people who arrive here, their English remains clunky, their children, they insist that their children learn English, so schooling becomes very important. And what is remarkable is that, you know, their children not only are going to high school, they're going to college. And so many of them graduate from UNC and from NC State and from other colleges, and because they realize that that is the only way they enter into the American middle class. And so they move away very quickly from that. And I think the other way of belonging is when they really establish roots. As a peddler, you have 2 suitcases. You can leave them, get on a boat and leave. But when you open a store, in Hickory, when you open a store in Goldsboro, when you open a store in New Bern or Charlotte or Raleigh, you're basically establishing roots, and I think that becomes part of it.
Right, you're invested in those communities.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about the contributions, because that's a big part of this exhibit and the project is to talk about and to highlight the contributions of Lebanese Americans here in North Carolina and the South.
Well, one can sort of start with the economic contribution. I think, again, one of the way we think about immigrants is this idea that somehow they're getting money, but in fact, study after study shows us that immigrants contribute a great deal of money into the economy. So just to give you an example, the George family, which owns Merchants Distributors Incorporated based in Hickory, is basically a $2 billion industry. The George family started about 75 years ago with a small grocery store, right? And they built it up into this large distribution network that owns Lowe's Foods right now. So if you're looking in dollar amounts, in total, the Lebanese American community contributes about $5 billion to the North Carolina economy. They have, in terms of income or what have you. But I think more importantly than money, I believe, although that is important, is what we contribute culturally. I think one of the things that we find is that there's this immense richness that the Lebanese Americans, as well as other American community, bring to North Carolina. It's what makes us really an amazing state. It's this kind of rich cultural brew that we have. And so in many ways, it is the fact that, you know, if you look around now in North Carolina and the United States, Lebanese food has become almost, you know, like regular part of food.
A staple, yeah.
It is a staple indeed. So whether it's Neomond or City Restaurant or Jasmine's or a host of other restaurants around here, it's part of the culture. The music, you know, in our festivals is part of it as well. But I think there's something else even a little bit, perhaps not quite as tangible, but very powerful. They become neighbors. They become members of the PTA, the Boy Scouts. And in that sense, they bring with them a different way of looking at the world. They are bringing the world into, you know, the homes, into the meeting rooms, into what have you, and a different perspective on things. And I think that is very powerful and very important. It not only enriches us, it energizes us and gives us a really different approach. And I think that's, to me, probably one of the richest and perhaps least tangible contribution, you know, that you can see. But it's there.
Absolutely, it's very powerful.
It is a very powerful contribution.
And when you talk about, you talked about the early immigrants having to change their names and, you know, kind of acclimating to their surroundings. With that, you change a little, you lose a little bit of your identity. How do immigrants maintain a sense of their own identity while acclimating and adapting to American culture as well?
I think food in every culture is very important. And I think that's one of the ways that we define ourselves, right? In many ways, in terms of these sort of little subcultures. So I think one of the ways that they do is they bring with them these recipes, and they continue to try, even in the 1890s, 1900, when olive oil was not, you know, off the shelves of Food Line.
Right.
They would still import it from New York, and they would bring the staples that allows them to make Lebanese food. And when they couldn't, they would improvise. So if they didn't have pistachios for baklava, they would bring pecans. And when they didn't have grape leaves to make rolled grape leaves, they would use cabbage leaves, right? So that when they didn't have lamb, they had pork. But in essence, they kept food in the kitchens, the smells, the taste that evoked a sense of culture. I think the churches, as well as you know, the religious organization that they established, was another way. So for example, I think in many ways the Catholic Church in North Carolina owes much of its early roots to these early immigrants, because they came and established small little churches here and there. They attempted to keep their language alive by bringing new Arab American newspapers from New York, or by writing, and we can see some of their notebooks in which they're writing a little poetry or even religious hymns. So those are the elements. And then they create a sense of community. They have organizations where they meet for a picnic once a year, or for a large festival in the NC Fairgrounds. In 1932, it's a huge festival that took place in June that brought Lebanese Americans from all across the South, from as far as Florida and Georgia. So those are the kind of ways in which they kept, you know, in many ways, their sense of who they are alive, and pass it on to their children.
Absolutely. How can people find out more information about this project?
Well, I think they can visit our website. That's a really easy way to do it. And it's the address I think you showed right here.
Yeah, lac.chass.ncsu.edu.
That is correct. And so they're welcome to visit that. They can contact me through the website, and the people who work there would be happy to provide them with any information they want. And we would, of course, invite them to come to the museum exhibit, because we tell that story there, and there are ways there in which they can also find out more about it.
Okay, excellent. We're going to take another break, and we'll talk more in just a minute.
Great.
Be back with more Tar Heel Talk after these messages. Welcome back to Tar Heel Talk. I'm Sonia Williams. We're talking today about Lebanese American history in North Carolina, and a new exhibit that documents this history is currently on display. Cedars in the Pines, the Lebanese in North Carolina, looks at 130 years of history in our state and in the South. And you can see the exhibit now through August 31st at the North Carolina Museum of History. For more information, call 919-807-7850 or log on to ncmuseumofhistory.org. And with us again is Dr. Akram, Director of the Kerala Program for Lebanese American Studies at North Carolina State University. Now, before the break, we were talking about, again, those families, those personal stories, and how the families not only acclimated to American culture, but remained true to their Lebanese roots as well. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the families that have shared their history and culture with us. We have some photographs, and we'll put those up and let you talk about those families.
Sounds great. This is, as you can see from here, Isabel and El Zaytoun. The Zaytouns arrived in New Bern, and they actually migrated here. And probably your viewers will know the Zaytoun very well because they have a lot of orthodontics.
Exactly.
They're a very illustrious
I was going to ask if it was the same family.
It is the same family, and it is a very, they are obviously, one of the scions of the, the society in Raleigh. They have done amazing stuff. They're a great family, and they arrived here just like most of these immigrants. Just the grandparents arrived, and they originally started living in the sort of the western part of the state, and well, more of the Triad, and they migrated a little bit east, and as they started out doing what everybody did, which is to do the peddling, to the selling, and what have you, and very quickly their children and grandchildren became these folks who are in dentistry and what have you. So the Zaytouns, and not only that, they have become a very important element of the Catholic community in North Carolina. They're very instrumental in the cathedral that's going to be going up soon. I think one of the Zaytouns actually is the chair of the committee that is spearheading it. So again, what you see is that this community immediately integrates itself into the larger community and begins to contribute very effectively.
Absolutely. And here is the Salem family.
Joe and Amelia Talon here. Joe actually served during World War II, and he served in the equivalent what would be the, basically he was in intelligence, and he was responsible for the stuff in North Africa, some of the theater in North Africa. And Joe is an amazing character. He unfortunately passed away shortly after we interviewed him. He was born and raised in New Bern, and he arrived here. His story is even more dramatic because he survived World War I in Lebanon, and during that war, about a third, and in some villages, about half of the population died of a terrible famine that lasted in 1915, 1916. His father had come here and had left the family behind, as usual, till he could establish himself. But then the war, started, and they had no news of each other whatsoever. And the father served in World War I himself, and he served with somebody from North Carolina here who helped him afterwards through the Red Cross to reach out to the family and bring him over. And Joe is a short guy who arrived here, I think he was about 7 or 8. And very quickly, he, rises, becomes valedictorian of his high school class, an engineer. He's trained at NC State, and he works many years as an engineer. And he was incredibly proud of his heritage, but also of being North Carolinian. And that's why he served in World War II. And many of the people who arrive here immediately joined the armed forces, by the way.
Wow. And that, again, I think the overriding or underlying theme to every family story is just the hard work and dedication and commitment to education and giving back to the community.
Absolutely.
That really, really resonates.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think, the work ethic that Joe, when we were talking to him, he was quite remarkable. It's a work ethic that he not only had, he just worked through everything, including discrimination. At one point, he was up for a job at an electric company, and they wouldn't give it to him because he was Syrian, which was, as the Lebanese were known at that time. And his boss told him, you're overqualified for the job, but we can't give it to you because you're Syrian. And I think many of your viewers will understand this notion of discrimination, but he still worked through it. And I asked him specifically because, I said, so how was it to be in this kind of environment? He says, well, the best way you fight that is to work hard and to prove them wrong. It's unfair, it's unacceptable, but it's the reality that he dealt with. And so I think in many ways they just didn't shy away from a fight, so to speak. And they fought their way to be members of the society through work ethics and through creating the sense of community.
Right, absolutely powerful. Let's talk a little bit about the exhibit and what people can expect, because it's now open to the public. What can people expect to see through each section?
So what we decided to do is to create a multimedia exhibit that tells this story in 3 stages. And what we have done is to combine text and images. And most of the photographs and the images that we got, as you see from what we saw on the screen earlier, are from families that have been so kind and so willing to share with us. And so that is part of it. We also have objects, tangible objects that have a lot of memories for people, things that they brought with them, you know, whether it's an Arabic Bible or whether we're talking about, you know, a trousseau, one of the elements of the trousseau that a mother gave to her daughter as she got married here. So we have those kind of things that really have meanings to people. And to give them a sense of their humanity, you know, what they really valued, what they kept. And we asked the community to tell us what they want to show, and in essence, that's what we're putting. And then we have other things that are more interactive. So, for example, you know, there's a place where you can smell spices that are very central.
Wonderful.
And try to guess what they are. A small little space in which we simulate what it felt to cross the Atlantic in steerage cabin as an immigrant, and how many people fit into that small cabin. The weight of a suitcase that peddlers used to carry. And we have also a lot of digital stuff that we have integrated into it that all pretty much tells the stories in various stages. So it's to excite the various senses, I suppose, of the visitor.
Absolutely. What do you hope that visitors to the exhibit learn from the exhibit and the experience?
Well, I think the first thing we wanted people to understand, through especially with the title, 130 Years of History, is that these are not newcomers in many ways. They have been part and parcel of the history of North Carolina for about 130 years. They're in essence threads in the fabric of the state. Whether we're talking about economics, you know, politics, society, or culture, they're part of the state. They are not the other, as we started with the segment, they are not somebody that's out there. They're actually part of who we are. They're very similar to who we are. And I think the other thing that we want them to understand is that their struggles are not that different from the struggle of any group of people that are trying to be part of a society. This is a very similar story. It's a very familiar story to any immigrant. You could be Polish, you could be Italian, you could be Jewish or Lebanese. It's all very similar. And I think it's that kind of common humanity that allows us to transcend the boundaries we sometimes artificially place between each other.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what we want to do.
A great educational moment for us all. Dr. Cater, thank you so much for taking the time to share this project with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's Tar Heel Talk. To comment on this or other episodes of the show, send us a message on our Facebook page or an email to tarheeltalk@fox50.com. I'm Sonia Williams. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week.
You were with me last time, saw just a little spattering of green. Now we're starting to see that grow. This is an indication of warming taking place at the surface. This would be mainly more in the way of rain instead of freezing rain, which means it won't build up on trees and power lines. So if we see this trend continue to the north and west, we may see less ice across parts of Wake County and into Harnett County and up into Franklin County. The numbers are in the low 30s for Rocky Mount, Fayetteville, Irwin, 34 right now at Lewisburg. Farther north and west, still some sleet going on. And there are signs that toward daybreak we may see a break in the action as low pressure makes its way up the east coast, and by